seats. There's a lot of empty seats over to the side, and there's some up in front. We have a lot of folks still in the food line, so we'll kind of allow them to move through and they can find themselves a seat. Good evening. My name is Father Tim Eden. I'm the Vice President for Mission and Identity here at St. Mary's, and so I'd like to welcome all of you. Those of you who are from St. Mary's, welcome here. And those who are visiting from outside, it's a pleasure to have you with us this evening. Tonight is the last of our series, unfortunately. Maybe because of the popularity, we'll go back to this in the near future. It's the last in our series, the third in our series on faith and science, religion and science. And we're honored this evening to welcome Dr. John Haught, who is just recently, after a long career at Georgetown University, just recently retired from Georgetown. We're honored to welcome him as our speaker this evening. He is, as you will hear, a scholar, and as I think those of us who met him on campus in the last 2 days, he is also a gentleman, a wonderful human being, and that's an important quality as well. He has worked in this field for over 40 years, and among the thousands of students that he has influenced through the classroom, he has also, beyond that, affected untold numbers of people with his books, 22 and counting, is what I understand. So please, can we give Dr. John Haught a St. Mary's welcome.
Thank you, Father Tim, for that very generous introduction. I want to also thank you for your hospitality. It's just been a pleasure being here. Thank you also, Glenn and Carla MacTaggart, for sponsoring this lecture series. I'm very appreciative. Thank you. And thank all of you for being here this evening. Well, you just heard that I was introduced as a theologian. Maybe not everybody here knows what theologians are. Theologians are people who don't make much money, but at least they know why. I could also add, since I've met a couple people from the philosophy department here today, that my son is a philosopher as well, and I always tell him that I tried myself. I tried very hard to become a philosopher, but cheerfulness kept breaking in. and so I had to become a theologian. About 2 years ago, Science magazine sponsored survey of adults in 34 different countries of the world, asking them the question, do you agree that humans developed from earlier living species? And in Iceland, about 87% of the population's polled said yes, and the numbers were very high also in Scandinavian countries and secular Western European countries. The lowest country on the list, only 27% of the people polled in Turkey could accept the fact that the idea of human evolution. And the next country up from Turkey was the United States, where at this time only 40% of those polled could accept the idea that we had non-human ancestors. On this map, the red states and the pink states, has nothing to do with politics, are all places where there have been significant initiatives in the United States against the teaching of evolution in public schools. And the most important instance of this took place in the rural county of Dover, Pennsylvania, where the school board there resolved that the students should be made aware of what they call the gaps and problems in Darwin's theory of evolution, and that the students should be exposed to an alternative theory called intelligent design, which is the idea that the complexity of life is so staggering that it could not possibly have come about by purely natural causes. There had to be some non-natural cause, intelligent design, which of course in our culture people usually identify with the God, the creator God of biblical religion, who was responsible. And teach both theories in the classroom, the school board said, and then let the kids decide. Let them be exposed to an alternative. Well, as you know, this would strike and did strike scientists as silly to the point of being comparable to asking the kids to decide between chemistry and alchemy, or phrenology and neurology, or physics and magic. Well, not every parent in the school board was happy with this resolution. Not every parent in the district was happy with it. So they brought suit against the school board, and this suit was supported by the American Civil Liberties Union, by Citizens United for the Separation of Church and State, and by a pro bono law firm, which, since I have been writing on evolution and faith, they asked me to testify, and I was happy to testify on behalf of the complaining parents that intelligent design is not something that should be taught in public schools. It's a violation of the First Amendment, nor is it really good theology as well, as you'll see as I go on tonight. Anyway, the case went to trial. Judge John E. Jones, who had been a George Bush appointee, decided to learn a lot during the process, and at the end he decided against the school board, saying it's an imprudent and ultimately unconstitutional policy to teach intelligent design in public schools. And he even used very intemperate language. He referred to what he called the breathtaking inanity of the board's decision, which has now been fully revealed through this trial. In November of the following year, the Dover School Board was voted out of office, which prompted Pat Robertson, the TV evangelist, who would certainly be considered somewhat biblically literalist in his approach to the faith, said this. He said that, I'd like to say to the good citizens of Dover, if there is a disaster in your area, don't turn to God, you just rejected him from your city. And he said, God is tolerant and loving, but we can't keep sticking our finger in his eye forever. If they have future problems in Dover, I recommend they call on Charles Darwin. Maybe he can help them. So this gives you a very brief snapshot of a very, very serious kind of cultural warfare that's been going on in the United States for some time on the issue of evolution. So what I wanted to talk about tonight was what is really at stake for so many people that they oppose evolution with such vigor and intensity. And I think to put the best face on it, and to be fair to these people, we have to realize that for them, what's really at stake is nothing less than the existence of a God creator. Their thinking is, well, if evolutionary processes brought about all the species over the course of time, what place for a creator, many people ask. And for many people also, what's at stake is the goodness of creation. We hear in Genesis that God, after each day of creation, pronounces it good. What's good about a process that brings about life in the rough and ragged and often violent way that evolution seems to do? And who are we? What is our identity if there are no sharp breaks between us and other species? Very, very important question. And if you're Christian, for many people, what is the meaning of Christ if Darwin is right? And what is the scope of redemption? Is it just human life and human suffering that's redeemed? Or is there a place for the redemption of all the suffering that's gone on through millions and millions of years of evolution as well? To sum it all up, to make it a little bit tidy, what I want to ask about is whether Darwinian evolution Darwin's theory of evolution, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment, is compatible with fundamental teachings of biblical religions about divine providence and divine wisdom, that there's a principle of care that provides for everything, and that there's an infinite divine wisdom that underlies the universe. How do these ideas hold up in an age of biological evolution? Before Darwin came along, before science came along, it was much easier to locate the place for divine providence, divine care, and divine wisdom within the scheme of things, because the universe was thought of as a hierarchy of vertical, static levels, starting with matter at the bottom, then plants, then animal life, then human life, and then perhaps angelic spheres, but all superintended by divine care and divine wisdom. This was the picture of life, picture of reality that sculpted the religious and ethical sensibilities of almost everybody in the West, in the Western Christian world, and there are parallel versions in Eastern religious cultures as well. And I would wager that almost everybody in this room tonight has had his or her ethical and religious sensibilities sculpted in accordance with this very traditional sacramental vision of reality, where each level is said to reflect in its own way an eternal divine wisdom and providence, where, at least until recently, almost everybody in the Christian world thought of the species of life as all created in a fixed way in the beginning, and that beginning was not so long ago. And the discontinuity of levels in the hierarchy allowed us humans to think that we have our own special niche and that we are cared for in a very special way by divine love and divine wisdom. But now, let's move somewhat abruptly into the new scientific way of understanding the universe. The hierarchy has been left behind by most educated people. Today, almost every scientist in the world accepts the theory, the Big Bang theory of the universe, according to which the universe is now said to be about 13.8 billion years old. When I taught science and religion at Georgetown, I used to ask my students to imprint upon their senses this picture of 30 big books, each book standing for 450 pages long, and each page standing for 1 million years in the story. So the Big Bang would take place on page 1 of volume 1, and the first two levels, the first two shelves, and part of the third, consist of what seems to be essentially lifeless and mindless evolutionary, chemical, and physical processes. The Earth spins out around the Sun around 4.5 billion years ago, and a billion or so years later, the first embers of life begin to glow, but they don't really billow until you get almost to the end of volume 29, where the famous Cambrian explosion takes place, and all of a sudden life leaves behind this purely unicellular way of being for several billion years and suddenly becomes much more complex, multicellular. And biologists tell us that all the species extant today, including ourselves, are descended from some of the forms of life that began to complexify at an accelerating pace around 570 million years ago. And dinosaurs, whom we associate with Paleological antiquity, don't come in until after the middle of volume 30. They go extinct on page 385, which leaves only the last 65 pages for the flourishing and development of mammalian life, and eventually primates. We depart from them somewhere around 50 pages ago. We, descendants of Cro-Magnon humanity, anatomically modern humans, when do we come in? We come in only toward the bottom, the last tenth, the last fifth, or perhaps even the last tenth or so of the very last page. of volume 30. This is when what we associate with mind, intelligence, ethical aspiration, and religious longing finally enter into the texture of this story. So, if you're a thoughtful person today, if you're an educated person today, and if you're theologically interested to boot, as I am, you can't help but wonder what's really going on. If you're Bertrand Russell, the famous British skeptic, you might say that if the point of this story is to produce intelligence, then why did it take so long to produce so little? There are a lot of things that we could talk about with respect to these 30 volumes, and tomorrow night at the Oblate School of Theology, I'm going to talk about this 30-volume set from another point of view, from a more cosmic point of view. But tonight I want to talk about what's going on in that last row of books, some of which I've colored. This is when, after life comes about, the Darwinian recipe for the transformation of life into all the species that have existed over the course of time and today came about. And this recipe, we can say, consists of 3 ingredients. You need lots of accidents, plus the rigorous rule of natural selection, plus lots and lots of time. Let's go over these very briefly. Accidents in the origin of life itself, which is not explicitly an evolutionary problem, but most scientists would say that life seems to have come about as a kind of unplanned fluke event somewhere in volume 22. It was unintentional, and it was the result of what philosophers call contingency, lack of necessity, and lack even of intelligibility, it would seem. Accidents also in the variations, or what we today call genetic mutations, which provide the raw material for evolution, and accidents in natural history, such as, for example, when an asteroid impacted the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago, causing something like a nuclear winter, wiping out the large reptiles and the dinosaurs, but opening up ecological niches for the mammals to crawl out of their holes in the ground and begin to flourish, eventually becoming primates, and eventually becoming you and me. If our own existence depends on accidents like this, lots of thoughtful people are wondering, well, what is the meaning of God? A lot of them think that God is an intelligent designer, like the people in Dover, Pennsylvania, and many, many others. In fact, we were all influenced in our religious education by this notion of divine intelligent design. And natural selection seems to operate so ruthlessly and uncaringly, selecting only those organisms which by accident are going to be adaptive and are going to therefore survive long enough to reproduce. Is this fair? Where is divine care? Where is divine wisdom if natural selection is the mechanism for evolutionary change, as Darwin taught and as almost all evolutionary biologists agree today? Now, don't get up and walk out of the room yet. Please, hang with me. The story gets different. It's a very interesting story. In deep time, many people have asked, well, if there's a divine intelligent designer, why fool around for so many billions and billions of years before bringing about living and thinking beings? What's that all about? What's the meaning, if any, religiously, of deep time, which we've only really discovered in its depth in the last century or so? This is thanks especially to Einstein, who himself was shocked by the idea. So, where is divine providence? Where is divine wisdom, if this is the way nature operates and functions? Before I go any further, though, I want to point out that there's an alternative theory as to why the dinosaurs became extinct. And for many people, the question is, how do you reconcile the fact, what evolutionists consider to be a fact, that our ancestors existed at one time habitats like swamps, and later in holes in the ground, and later swung from trees. How do you, if you've thought about it at all, and I hope you'll think about it tonight, how do you reconcile this story with any classic theological picture of the divine origin of human beings? Very soon after Darwin, caricatures of his thought were published in periodicals, and here's one where you can see there's no real sharp break anywhere, not only between humans and animals, but between animals and the mud from which life first came forth. So, is there any place for a sense of human specialness or human self-valuation if Darwin is right? And then there's the even more difficult question that Darwin himself was obsessed with. Even before Darwin, people were squeamish at the fact that life feeds so violently on life, nature red in tooth and claw, as Tennyson puts it. But Darwin was a very especially sensitive man, and he wrote to a friend of his, "What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horridly cruel works of nature." He talked about the dreadful and quiet war of organic beings that's going on in peaceful woods and smiling fields. Now, underneath the romantic veneer of nature, he saw something that nobody had seen before, namely millions and millions of years story of bloodletting and violence and struggling and suffering that had not been part of the consciousness of most religious people and most educated people until the 19th century. Which prompted his chief advocate, T.H. Huxley, to, after reading Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859, caused him to comment, what kind of example is nature setting for us humans if this is how life came about? And he concluded, and many people, philosophers and others since have concluded, that never again can we look to the natural world for instructions as to how we humans should conduct ourselves on this planet. And there are many similar sentiments expressed by contemporary scientists and philosophers. George Williams, one of the grand figures of contemporary biology, talked about nature as a wicked old witch because of the troubling way in which Darwinian processes had let life onto our planet. You could think of many, many similar examples. My favorite is the life cycle of the sheep liver fluke. Now, I know you're all familiar with this, so bear with me as I recall something you may have forgotten. There's a parasite that lives near our ponds, and it lays eggs, and the eggs are able to develop legs, and they crawl into the pond, and they attach themselves to a water snail and start eating the snail away from the inside without even anesthetizing it before they start consuming it. Then the parasite reproduces asexually within the host, and more youngsters are produced, and they swim back to the edge of the pond, and they climb up blades of grass and bury themselves in little cyst-like formations on the grass, so that a cow or a sheep will come along and will eat the grass. The cyst will dissolve in the digestive juices, and more worms crawl out. They make their way into the liver and the bile ducts, and in the process cause enormous discomfort to the animal. The Scots refer to it as sheep rot. And more eggs are laid, and the cycle repeats again and again over thousands upon thousands of years. So again, if you're a thoughtful person, and especially if you're a sensitive religious person to boot, you can't help but ask the question today that maybe our ancestors did not ask the way we do today. What is going on here? Sir Charles Sherrington, as you can see from his picture, is not very happy about this. Sir Charles, a great scientist, was asked to give the Gifford lectures, which were about the relationship between nature and God. And he said that he had some problems about this. He says, as he looks at the sheep liver fluke, it's a story of securing existence to a worm at cost of lives superior to it in the scale of life, at least as humanly reckoned. And he says what's going on here is life's prize is given to the aggressive and inferior of life. And this is only one example of many that we could think of. So what's going on here? Sir Richard Dawkins, who's probably the best known evolutionist in the world today, never lets an opportunity pass to tell his readers that Darwinism goes best with atheism. And here's the reason. What's going on is the DNA, genes being segments of DNA, so long as DNA is passed on from one generation to the next, it doesn't matter who or what, which organism gets hurt or has to undergo suffering, like the sheep or the cow in the last example. Genes don't care about suffering because they don't care about anything. And he draws this philosophical conclusion: the universe we observe, meaning the Darwinian universe, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, no providence, no divine wisdom. In fact, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And so Dawkins has made Darwinian science the foundation of what's called the new atheism. In another book of his, Dawkins gives us a rather ingenious example of time. He says, imagine a mountain on one side of which there is a sheer vertical drop-off from the top of the mountain and perpendicular to the plain below. And then imagine the other side of the mountain as a gentle slope, say at a 45-degree angle. If life had only a biblical span of 6,000 to 10,000 years to evolve from, say, a primitive cell to something as complex as the human eye or the human brain, if that's all the time that were available, then there would be a good reason to bring in the notion of intelligent design or theology of some sort to try to make sense of how something so improbable could happen in such a short amount of time. But go around to the other side of the mountain, the gentle slope, and imagine the story of life meandering lazily back and forth up the slope side of the mountain for a period of roughly 3.8 billion years, or rounded off to 4 billion years, and then mix that in with the other two ingredients of the evolutionary recipe, lots of accidents or chance or randomness, and then the rigorous, remorseless process of natural selection. Mix those three ingredients up, and then, given that amount of time, the emergence of something as complex as the eye or the brain would not be so improbable after all. It would be probable, and you could have, therefore, after Darwin, a purely natural explanation of what it seemed intelligent design advocates had been advocating because they had too small a time span in their understanding of the cosmos. So now, after Darwin, Dawkins' point is theology is superfluous. And Dawkins cannot imagine why any university in the world hosts things as obsolete as theology departments after Darwin. Now, don't get up and walk out yet. Just one more example. I can come up with thousands of examples of scientific and philosophical thinkers who have the sentiments of David Barbash, who's an evolutionist at the University of Washington, who says that religious believers must attribute the intricate design in life directly to an intelligent designer, since, as he puts it, only a designer could generate such complex, perfect wonders. But in fact, as naturalists and biologists and others have found, the living world is shot through with imperfection. There are no perfect designs. There are all sorts of design flaws all over the place, and almost studying any kind of anatomy and organism will find that nothing is perfect about it at all. So he concludes, unless one wants to attribute either incompetence or sheer malevolence to a designer, namely God, this imperfection, namely the manifold design flaws we find all over life points incontrovertibly to a natural rather than a divine process. So it's either Darwin or God, but not both. And now, after Darwin, it has to be nature, to a natural rather than a divine process, one in which living things were not created out of scratch, de novo, but evolved. So he's one of many who would say if Darwin is right, life has no religious or theological meaning. Now, understandably, there's been a big pushback, especially in our country, but other countries of the world too, by the advocates of intelligent design theory. The chief architect of the intelligent design movement in the United States was a former Berkeley lawyer, Philip Johnson, who wrote a lot of books opposing Darwin, in which he would say over and over that Darwinism is not science at all. It's clearly atheistic ideology, and that's why we shouldn't teach it in public schools. Darwinism also, he says, is scientifically inadequate because it can't explain the complexity of living beings. And therefore, biology classes should give what he calls balanced treatment to intelligent design and evolution. Not allow both of them to be taught, but at least give the kids an alternative and let the kids decide. So with this in mind, this background in mind, I want to ask the question, can theology, Christian theology in general, but in my case, Catholic theology in particular, can theology get along with evolution? Here are some thoughts that we might want to consider in dealing with that question. Many people that I know, especially in the Catholic community, Catholic scientists as well as Catholic theologians, take what I call the blind faith approach. And this is an understandable approach, especially if you don't know much science and you don't probe too deeply into this question. Then you can say, as most Catholics do, yes, evolutionary biology is correct, and we'll send our kids to public schools, let them learn evolutionary biology. But keep in mind that terms like accidents, randomness, contingency, the troubling features of evolutionary theory that cause religious problems to people, these terms are devised by human ignorance. The thinking in this blind faith approach, is that we humans all have a very limited sense of what constitutes decent order and design. So that whenever something happens that doesn't fit into our conception of what is intelligible, we refer to it as an accident or maybe an absurdity. But maybe, for all we know, and certainly doesn't the Bible and doesn't religious instruction of all faiths tell us this, there's a much wider plan, a much wider design than our own, namely that of God, and that for all we know, we don't understand it, we shouldn't pry into it, but for all we know, behind Darwin's threefold recipe, there lies a wise and mysterious providential plan. We don't have any idea what that is, but blind faith is we believe in it anyway. And those who adopt this approach, and I think almost anybody who thinks seriously about faith and evolution, has to have something of this humility in this approach, attentiveness when you approach this question. People who accept this approach are fond of quoting the book of Job, where Yahweh, after listening to Job's lament, going chapter after chapter, appears out of the whirlwind and addresses Job and says to him, if you know so much, where were you when I, God, laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. The blind faith approach is fond of maxims such as God writes straight with crooked lines, or Isaiah's God saying, my ways are not your ways, so just accept it. The blind faith approach is a very tempting one. And as I said earlier, I think there has to be a touch of this, at least, in any theological inquiry into the meaning of things, especially evolution. But as a Roman Catholic myself, I was raised and taught in my theological training that theology is faith seeking understanding. Faith is not a dead end. Faith should be something that launches you into a journey, an adventure of discovery. Faith is something that doesn't cut off intelligibility from your mind, but should open your mind up to explore and look for deeper and deeper intelligibility to things. That's been the ideal of theology that I've been instructed in. And I just wondered why so many theologians just really don't dig into these issues. So what are some other alternatives? Here's another one, and I don't think any of these, and none of these are going to be fully satisfying to any of us, but at least let's try something here. One approach that is used by Catholic as well as non-Catholic thinkers is to interpret evolution as a kind of divine pedagogy, to look upon Earth, our planet, as a kind of school, and to understand evolution as the curriculum in the school of life. And the thinking here is expressed well by Guy Murchie in a book called The Seven Mysteries of Life. He says, yes, we have to admit Darwinian process is harsh, but that doesn't make it evil. Earth, he says, is a soul school in which obstacles are essential to life. Imagine how insignificant life would be today if it never had in its 4 billion year journey to face obstacles. If it never had those challenges, we'd all still be protozoa or amoebas. Life needs challenges to be alive. Life, to be alive, has to strive. And to strive, it has to come up against obstacles and challenges. Imagine how anemic of character we would be if none of us ever had to face any challenges in life. So this is this whole school of thought which looks at evolution in a different way. And Murchie, in his book, asks the reader, what kind of world would you have created? And he asks you to imagine for a moment that you are God. Now, this is something that will come more easily to some people than others. Imagine that you're God. What kind of world would you have created? And here's what he concludes. I don't know what your own thoughts on this are, but he says, honestly now, if you were God, could you possibly dream up any more educational, contrasting, thrilling, beautiful, tantalizing world than Earth, meaning the place that sponsors the Darwinian curriculum, to develop spirit or soul or character in? Would you try to make the world nice and safe? Maybe. Or would you let it be provocative, dangerous, and exciting? In actual fact, if it ever came to that, I'm sure you would find it impossible to make a better world than God, meaning the Darwinian world, has already created. So Darwin is right. But divine providence and divine wisdom are not opposed to evolution. They actually underlie it in this way of thinking. I wish we had more time to talk about this and to think about it. When I used to deal with this in class, I would pause and have the students comment on it. My problems with it are that it seems to me that pedagogy is not a very good framework, theologically or religiously or pastorally, for making sense of suffering, especially the excessive suffering that so many people and non-human forms of life have to go through. Why so much suffering? Wouldn't a lot less suffering be just as pedagogical? Darwin himself realized, and I think quite rightly, that there is something adaptive about suffering. When life develops into complex organisms with sensitive nervous systems, their capacity for suffering provides a kind of warning system that allows them to get out of danger and therefore increases the probability of survival and reproduction. And so it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. But what bothered Darwin was not suffering as such, but the excess of it and the unnecessary kind of suffering that he discovered in his understanding of life. And thirdly, in the final analysis, isn't this approach somewhat anthropocentric? I find myself asking, why do all the other species have to go to school with us, as it were? So if there is a truth to this approach, I think personally it has to be a small grain of a much larger truth, whatever that is. But before we abandon it, let's remember that the Bible, both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, experiment seriously with this approach. If you want a good example, read the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 5 and following. The new King James Version talked about how God chastiseth whom God loveth. God is a disciplinarian, and the suffering that we have to go through can be interpreted and accepted, the writer of the letter to the Hebrews says, if we accept it as a kind of discipline, tough love. And I've met a lot of people, including Catholics that I've talked to in parishes, who come up after I give a talk on this and say, yeah, I like that tough love approach. That's the kind of God that I believe in. What are your thoughts on this? My own thought, as I've developed them in several books, including a book called God After Darwin, and more recently in a book called The New Cosmic Story, are that we should stop, theologically speaking, looking for perfect design. That's a big mistake, I think, theologically. And so I'm very opposed to what's called the intelligent design, anti-Darwinism in our culture. I prefer to see life as a drama rather than a design. And a drama is something, as it turns out, that's still going on. The drama of the universe is one in which the universe is still coming into being. And so life is part of this cosmic drama. I want to emphasize that point. Furthermore, if living organisms were perfectly designed, as David Barris and others would prefer, then there would be no drama, because everything would have been fixed and frozen in perfection in the beginning, and therefore life would be over. Life would be dead on delivery if it were perfectly designed. There would be no flow. There would be no diversity, no adaptations that lead life to diversify into so many different kinds. There would be no continuity, no flow, no dramatic production going on here. And since stories and dramas are the essential vehicles of meaning, I wonder if there would be meaning to any universe that doesn't have the character of a story or an ongoing drama. But what I'm suggesting here then is that design flaws, instead of being an obstacle to faith, could be thought of as essential for life's having a dramatic meaning rather than architectural or engineering kind of intelligibility. We would look to life for a kind of narrative meaning, a narrative coherence or dramatic coherence. And that would mean that if life is dramatic rather than designed, we have to approach it the way we do any drama. If you go to a drama or play, you don't walk out after the first two acts. After the intermission, you go back. You wait for what the drama is all about. So what we've discovered now, after Darwin, we know this much better than Darwin did, especially after Einstein, we've discovered that the whole cosmos is a dramatic production for whose meaning, if we are to approach it realistically, we will have to wait. And it turns out, as I'll point out a little bit later, that waiting is a fundamental biblical virtue. We can learn a lot about how to approach evolution simply by obeying the fundamental instructions of our biblical ancestors that only those who wait will not be put to shame. And shouldn't we approach the cosmos with that same spirit? And I think furthermore that the fixation on intelligent design by both anti-Darwinian Christians as well as by people like Dawkins and David Barash is a mark of a kind of impatience. It's almost a tantrum-like demand. I want the full clarity of nature to hit me squarely in the face, and so it will all be over right now, rather than to adopt a posture of patience. There's a kind of perfectionism and puritanism that underlies the need, the obsession with design. I think it's much more biblical to look at nature as a drama. And that's the way science is now presenting it to us. And this is my second suggestion then, is to view the evolution of life as part of a much larger cosmic drama that's still going on. So don't ask whether biological design points to deity. Ask instead whether the whole cosmic story, which is still going on, carries a meaning. That to me is a much more interesting question. What possible meaning could be emerging in this cosmos? The cosmos that we live in is still coming into being. I think we need to get that thought into our heads. And if it's still coming into being, it's not finished. And if it's not finished, we can't expect it to be perfectly designed. We need to wait. I think that much of what we call the virtue of faith is learning how to wait. Because if something is worth waiting for, then we have to wait for it. So the biblical approach that I think meshes with what I've just said is one that looks to the Scriptures and finds in the Scriptures a God whose fundamental way of presenting the divine self to people, to the earth, to the Israelites, to Abraham, is that of opening up a future where there seems to be a dead end. This is the God of the Bible. So if that's the case, then we should look upon nature not as designed, but as promise, as pregnant with the future, as having new possibilities. And think of God as the source of these new possibilities, which open up a new future. The God of Isaiah, who says, "Behold, I make all things new." The God of John of the book of Revelation, who toward the end of the New Testament says, "Look, I'm the one who makes all things new." So God's not so much a designer or artificer or engineer as one who opens up a new future where there seem to be dead ends. Why not take this understanding of God with us when we look at the evolutionary picture of life that Darwin and his followers have given us? And if that's the case, then the ultimate explanation of evolution is the God who opens up the future, the God of promise. And I'm saying this because this helps me, at least, understand those three troubling characteristics of Darwin's recipe: accidents, plus the law of natural selection, plus deep time. These three qualities are the stuff of drama. To have a drama, you need some degree of randomness or openness to indeterminacy. But at the same time, you need a grammatical grid upon which the story is woven. You need some consistency, some reliability, some lawfulness. And you need lots and lots of time. So that's what we have. And what science has gifted us with in this new 30-volume story is a drama in which accidents are absolutely essential for this universe having a future. I mean, try to imagine a world without accidents. Such a world would be so frozen, so stiff, so finished, so perfect, it wouldn't have a future. And it would be going nowhere. It would be dead. At the same time, imagine a world without any consistent laws to it. And compare these laws, I suggest, to grammatical rules. If we use the metaphor of drama to represent the natural world, which I think we have to do after Einstein and Darwin, if you use the metaphor of drama, then the consistency or lawfulness that scientists have mistakenly taken as physical forces. They're more like grammatical rules. When you write a drama or an essay or a letter or whatever, you have to follow rigorous grammatical rules or you won't make any sense. But the rules do not determine the outcome. They facilitate a kind of creativity that allows you to bring unprecedented ideas and thoughts into your writing. So grammar is not something opposed to good writing, it's essential to it. And what I'm suggesting is that what scientists call the laws of physics and chemistry, or the law of natural selection, are not things that freeze nature into some sort of vice and make everything somehow suffer as a result of this determinism, but rather they're more like grammatical rules which facilitate the open-endedness of the story of nature. And deep time, instead of that being a problem for us, it should be something that gives us a sense of the dramatic depth of this universe of which we happen to be a part. And realistically, I mean, look at what's happened already. It's been a pretty good story so far, so why get too upset about the fact that we don't know exactly what the outcome of it is? Already, if we look for, not for design, but for narrative coherence, and we wait, we can see that already it's brought forth life, sentience, consciousness, freedom, faith, and hope. It's a pretty good universe. It's brought forth beings who are capable of making and keeping promises. That's not a bad world. And it's still not finished. It's still open. And I think personally that the question of why God creates through evolution is something that coincides with the question of why is freedom, or how is human freedom possible? The question of freedom and evolution, I think, are overlapping. Well, I said that I would talk a little bit about a Catholic perspective on evolution. Since this is a Catholic university and this series is about the Catholic intellectual tradition, let me say a few things about this. Catholic theology, like most Christian theology, instructs us not to think about God at all without thinking, first of all, about the man Jesus. Jesus is said to be the fullness of the revelation of God. So to think about God without thinking first about Jesus is a mistake. It's a mistake. You're going to end up with something that's not God, at least in the Catholic and Christian tradition. So you go to the Gospels to find out what God is like. You look at what Jesus is like. And you go to the epistles, like St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, where he takes an early Christian hymn, which says that even though Jesus was in the form of God, he emptied himself. He underwent a kenosis. The Greek word for emptying is kenosis. A kenosis. He emptied himself and took on the form of a slave. So we can't leave this picture of Jesus out when we think about God. We have to think about God as a self-emptying reality if we're looking at God from a Christian point of view. Here's what a famous Catholic theologian has written. See if you can identify the Catholic theologian that I'm talking about. The prime commitment of Catholic Christian theology, but Catholic theology in particular, is the understanding of God's kenosis, God's pouring the divine self out in complete self-abandonment to the creature. A grand and mysterious truth for the human mind, which finds it inconceivable that suffering and death can express a love which gives itself and seeks nothing in return. Maybe Catholics have not heard this message enough. The author of this is a Catholic. Who is more Catholic than the Pope? Well, I won't get into that because I know something. If you're doubting that this is a Catholic perspective, then this should remove your doubts. Anyway, what I'm suggesting on the basis of this is that this is the idea of God, the kenotic God, is the God that Christians should take with them in their conversations with science, including evolution. Not the idea of an omnipotent designer, but of a self-emptying, self-giving, self-sacrificing love. That's the image of God that's revealed in Christ. So John Paul II is also well known for a statement he made to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in 1996, when he said this, and this disturbed a lot of Christians. He said, fresh knowledge, meaning fresh scientific experimental knowledge, empirical knowledge, leads to the recognition of the theory of evolution as more than just a hypothesis. In other words, there are facts, there's experiment that backs it up. It's not just a wild guess. And then he went on to say that what theologians in the Catholic tradition need to do, and I've taken this seriously, is to explore what the meaning of evolution would be in the light of the kenotic, self-emptying understanding of God. And what would that look like? Just a few brief thoughts here. In the light of the kenosis of God, of the self-emptying of God, what should we expect the natural world to look like? Should we expect it to be full of perfect designs? Shouldn't we expect that even the creation of the world itself is not so much divine forcefulness as it is the result of a self-emptying God who, in a sense, contracts the omnipotence and the omnipresence and opens up a space for something other than God to come into existence? Isn't that the Christian understanding of creation? That God creates by making room for something other than God to come on to the scene, to come into existence. And if that's the case, if creation is the consequence of a divine self-humbling, so that God can allow for something other with which he can have a dialogical relationship, then can we expect that creation should have been perfectly and instantaneously designed and finished in one instantaneous act of divine magic in the beginning? Or shouldn't we expect that creation would be given the opportunity to experiment, to wander around, exploring different opportunities? In other words, what we see in the evolution of life. And that this would take lots and lots of time for this wondrous adventure to play itself out. So if that's the case, then divine providence and wisdom would actually be expressed in God's concern for the independence of creation. And that would mean concern that the creation be given freedom and autonomy to become itself. And at the same time, Christians can't forget that in Christ, God suffers. The cross should also be taken into any evolutionary theology, because it represents that God, the divine self, participates in the drama of the world's struggle and suffering. So this is just a thought. Another Catholic perspective is given by I think, the most important Catholic theologian of the 20th century, Karl Rahner. And Karl Rahner used to tell people in very convoluted language, Christianity is not very complicated. Christianity really has two essential truths. Christians, like other traditions, believe that there's this infinite divine mystery that encompasses everything, that's the source of everything, that we call God. But Christians add and emphasize, and this is what Pope John Paul was emphasizing in that quote that I gave you, that this infinite mystery, Rahner says, gives itself away in complete self-abandonment and self-sacrifice. to the finite world. This is what's really going on in the universe. Science doesn't have to see this. This is in no way contradictory to science, but underneath the surface, once you see the universe as a story can be read at many different levels, which do not necessarily conflict with one another. So let's look upon the universe as a story, and that's what science itself has agreed that it is, in which the infinite gives itself to the finite world. And that's the fundamental meaning of revelation. Before revelation is embodied in scriptural passages or doctrines, revelation, as even the First Vatican Council said, is God's self-communication to the world. That's what revelation is, God's self-communication to the world. And by anybody's mathematics, a finite world cannot receive the fullness of the infinite in one instant, but has to undergo a process of self-transcendence, of going beyond itself, in order to, if we want to use a Darwinian term, in order to adapt to the infinite environment. The finite world has to undergo a process of self-transcendence, which to the scientific eye turns out to be something like what we call evolution. So once you see the universe as this unfolding, unfinished story, then there should be room for both scientific understanding of it and theological readings of it. It makes a lot of difference once you see the whole of nature as a story rather than a state. Finally, I want to bring in the most important Catholic thinker on this question of evolution and faith. His name was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He was a Catholic priest, a Jesuit, who was by profession also a geologist who spent many years in China and became one of the most prominent geologists of the Asian continent. And he thought, starting when he was still very young, a young priest, he thought we have to reconcile what he was finding in his geology and paleontology and evolutionary science. We have to find some way to put that together with what we believe about God, about Christ, and about the Spirit. And he doesn't pretend to have any final answer to the question of suffering. Suffering is the open wound of theology, and no theology can ever pretend to have closed that wound off. Suffering is something that calls out not for reason, but for redemption. So Teilhard is not proposing that he has any final answer to this question, but he does suggest that now, after Darwin and after Einstein, we have to accept the fact our ancestors knew nothing about, and that's that the universe that we live in is still coming into being. It's an unfinished universe that science has now given us. I put 30 volumes on that slide earlier in my talk. Those 30 volumes could turn out in the final analysis to be only the dawn, in which many, many other volumes yet remain to be written. The world is open to an indeterminate future in a way that we never knew prior to the 20th and late 19th century. But an unfinished universe is a universe that, by definition, is not finished. And if it's not finished, it's not perfected. And if it's not perfected, then it's imperfect. And if it's imperfect, then it has a dark side to it. And suffering somehow gains a foothold in the dark side of an unfinished universe. All the problems that bother us, why life struggles, why suffering exists at all, why we have to walk by faith and in darkness and not by sight and by light, and why our religions, including his own, the Catholic religion, are so imperfect. Religions are part of an unfinished universe. They are just as unfinished as the universe of which they are a part. And why hoping, once evolution becomes conscious of itself in us, the only way it can carry itself forward is by our grasping for it, anticipating a new future. And why it's through our hoping that the universe can keep evolving. If we decide not to hope, if we despair, then we are going against the grain of this wonderful universe. into which we're born. Which leaves us then with the big question: why would a good God, a providential and infinitely wise deity, make an unfinished universe in the first place? Why not finish it off once and for all? Teilhard says, and I think rightly, that there is no real intelligible alternative to an unfinished initial creation. That an originally perfect creation would be theologically inconceivable. Why? Because imagine a creator in the beginning creating a perfectly rounded off, finished, completed universe. This perfect creation, if you think about it, would not really be distinct from its creator. It would be an extension of the divine will. It would be an appendage to deity rather than something distinct from God. And one of the fundamental principles of faith in all three Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, is that God is not the world, and the world is not God. The Abrahamic traditions decisively reject pantheism, the idea that God is the world. So if the world is to be distinct from God, then it cannot be a perfect, immediate, instantaneous, magical implementation of the divine will, but it has to have a kind of internal autonomy. A perfect creation would not be, in other words, distinct from God. It would be a world without suffering and evil, sure, but it would be a world without a future, since everything would be finished. Nowhere else for the world to go. A perfect world, an initially, magically, instantaneously perfect world, would also be a world without freedom. Everything would be fixed and determined in its final place for all eternity. There would be no wiggle room, no room for it to become new, and no room for freedom to exist. And finally, it would be a world without life, because life requires the indeterminacy of the future in order for it to strive to overcome present obstacles and become something new. When you first came into the room tonight, I had a quote on the first slide from Theodosius Dobzhansky, who was a very well-known Russian geneticist, and he came to this country and he became the first president of the American MacTaggart Association. And he is famous for saying that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. After many years of thinking about this problem myself, I've come to the conclusion that nothing in theology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Now, can I have 5 more minutes of your time? I've gone on too long, but I know that some of you might be wondering whether you're Catholic, Christian, or non-Christian. How does the person of Christ fit into this evolutionary universe? And I'm going to end by doing something I don't usually like to do, and that's just to quote someone, because I can't say it any better than this someone does. And this someone is, again, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. In his book, one of his books, he says that God did not will individually the sun, the earth, the planets, the stars, and so forth, the galaxies, or humanity. This is in his book, Science and Christ. Instead, he says, God first willed his Christ, and this is another way of expressing the first words in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning, God, the Word means meaning. In the beginning, there was meaning. And everything in creation, John goes on to say, was created in accordance with this Word. As Teilhard puts it, first God willed his Christ. But in order to have his Christ, God had to create the spiritual world, including humanity, the human evolution, in particular, upon which Christ might germinate. There's no Christ apart from the preparation of the whole human dimension of cosmic evolution. And to have humanity, God had first to launch the vast process of organic life, biological evolution. And the birth of that organic life called for the entire cosmic turbulence. He's referring here to the Big Bang theory, which he had just become aware of in the later years of his life. He died in 1955. By that time, he knew and was excited about the theory of relativity and the new science, which tells us that the whole cosmos is in the process of becoming. So he was very favorably disposed toward Big Bang cosmology. He goes on to say the prodigious expanses of time, deep time, that we've been talking about, which preceded the first Christmas, were not empty of Christ. It's not a waste. Those many volumes before life came about were not a waste at all. They were imbued with the influx of Christ's power already. It was the ferment of his conception that stirred up the cosmic masses and directed the initial developments of the biosphere, the sphere of life. It was the travail preceding his birth that accelerated the development of instinct and the birth of thought upon the earth. The fearful, anonymous labors of primitive humanity, the beauty fashioned through its age-long history by ancient Egypt, the anxious expectancies of Israel, the endless refining of wisdom by the Greeks, all these were needed before the flower could blossom on the rod of Jesse and of all humanity. All these preparatory processes were cosmically and biologically necessary that Christ might set foot upon our human stage. And all this labor was set in motion by the active, creative awakening of his soul, inasmuch as that human soul had been chosen to breathe life into the universe. When Christ first appeared in the arms of Mary, he had already stirred up the world. That's the drama. Thank you very much.